All right, welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're trying something a little different, see? We're going to see if we can get you feeling good about basic English conversation, like really quickly. And we're only using one podcast episode transcript to do it. Kind of a fun challenge.
Yeah, it's definitely doable, especially with the episode we've got. It's from the Learn English podcast. And the way they structured it, it really focuses in on the stuff that matters most when you're starting out. No need to get bogged down with tons of grammar right off the bat.
Exactly. And they've kind of given us a roadmap, starting with greetings, introductions, and then building up to a whole practice dialogue. Kind of like what we're doing with this deep dive, huh?
Exactly. And they jump right into those greetings, which makes total sense. Think about it. How often does any conversation start without some kind of hello, no matter what language you're speaking? It's so true. And they start with hello, like that's the universal option, but then they point out hi and hey for when you're in more casual situations, which I bet is a relief for someone just starting out, right? Like not everything has to be super formal.
Right. It's about having options. And what's cool is how they immediately go into how are you after that, but not just as a phrase, but as a real way to show you're interested in the other person. They even give examples of common responses like, I'm good, I'm fine, I'm doing well. Just those few cover so much ground.
Yeah, it's like that cheat sheet you need for those first few moments of a conversation. I remember when I was learning, your native language, those back and forths were what I struggled with most at first.
It's a bit of a dance, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the podcast actually encourages listeners to practice it right then and there in the episode, but they're putting you in the conversation from the very start. I love that. Okay, so building on the greetings, they move into introductions.
Yeah.
And get this, they actually give two ways to do it. My name is, or I'm. Isn't it nice to know both are correct? Takes the pressure off a bit.
What I like is they don't just give you the answer to what's your name, they include the question itself too. It's like they're anticipating what you'll hear from the other person, so it feels more real,
It's all about context. All right, listener, time to put this into practice. They encourage you to say your name out loud, so go for it. My name is, see, you're already speaking English.
Don't underestimate the power of those small steps.
All right, now for vocabulary. The podcast picks out book, pen, and pable as like these super basic words. I'm trying to think. Can you even think of a situation where those wouldn't be useful?
They're pretty fundamental, yeah. But the cool thing is they don't just stop at the single words. They immediately build those into simple sentences like, I have a book, I need a pen. It's like they're sneaking in grammar while you're learning vocab.
It's like setting you up for success without you even realizing it. All right, let's try those sentences out. Repeat after me. Ready? I have a book, I need a pen. There is a table in the room. Boom, you're speaking in full sentences now.
And starting to internalize that sentence structure, even if you don't realize it, repetition is key.
Speaking of repetition, let's get to pronunciation. Now, the podcast uses ship versus sheep as the example. Might seem a little random, but there's a method to their madness.
Right. It's probably because that I versus E sound difference is something that trips up a lot of learners whose native language doesn't make that distinction. And the podcast makes the point that it's not just about being grammatically correct, but about being understood clearly,
Getting your message across. So let's try it. Ship, sheep. Hear that difference. Just that tiny change in the vowel sound makes a whole new word.
It does, and it shows how even a small sound change can totally change what you mean. Something to pay close attention to as you're learning.
For sure. Okay, ready for the fun part? We've got a real-life conversation simulation. It's a dialogue between two strangers meeting. Kind of like a mini drama. You ready to hear this?
Yeah, let's hear it. Let's see how all this stuff we've talked about comes together.
All right, here we go. Hi, I'm Sarah. What's your name?
Hi, Sarah. My name is John.
Nice to meet you, John. How are you today?
I'm doing great, thank you. How about you?
I'm good. Thanks for asking.
Okay.
So what do you do, John?
I'm learning English. I listen to podcasts like this to practice.
That's awesome. Keep up the great work.
And Cecine, that flowed pretty well, actually.
It did. And it combined all those things we talked about. Greeting, introduction, the how are you, even a little bit of small talk there at the end. It's amazing what you can do with just a handful of basic phrases.
It's a testament to the power of structure, And you noticed how the podcast used that repetition to reinforce the important phrases and instructions.
Yeah, it's like they're building a foundation brick by brick. And speaking of foundations, the podcast ends with 3 tips for effective learning, which I think are worth highlighting.
Definitely. These tips are good for any new skill you're trying to learn, not just language.
So true. Okay, first up, daily practice. Even if it's just a few minutes, the consistency matters. That one really resonates with me. It's easy to get overwhelmed if you try to do too much at once.
It's about building a habit, making it part of your routine. Just like going to the gym, you wouldn't expect to see results overnight, but with regular effort, you start noticing the difference.
Exactly. Okay, second tip is all about immersion. Watching English TV, listening to music, heck, even switching your phone's language settings.
Yeah.
It's about surrounding yourself with it.
And the best part is, it doesn't have to feel like work. Find stuff you enjoy that just happens to be in English, and you'll naturally pick things up.
Sure.
Think about it, listener. What do you enjoy that you could experience in English? Fun little thought experiment.
It is. Okay, and lastly, maybe the most important tip, be patient. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither is fluency in a new language.
This is where so many people stumble, They get discouraged because they don't see results fast enough. But language learning is a journey. It's not a race. You've got to enjoy the process, enjoy those little wins along the way, celebrate your progress.
I love that. And it goes back to their earlier point about not being afraid to make mistakes. Mistakes are how we learn.
Exactly. Mistakes are feedback, They tell you what you need to work on, what you need more practice with. Embrace them, learn from them, and move on. It really is amazing how much they fit into such a short episode. Like, it's the bare bones of what you need to have a basic conversation.
Yeah, I was a little skeptical at first, like how much could we really get from just one podcast transcript? But I have to say, I'm impressed. It's like they concentrated all the important stuff down into this little package.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just the content, but how it's presented, The podcast is very deliberate in how it builds from one thing to the next.
Right. And they even give us a little preview of what's coming up in future episodes. Ordering food, asking for directions, talking about your day, stuff our listener will probably need in real life.
Exactly. And that brings up a key point about learning a language. You've got to have a solid foundation to build on. Start with the basics, then work your way up.
Kind of like how we're doing this deep dive. We started with those greetings and introductions, added the vocabulary, the pronunciation, and now we're seeing how it all comes together in a real conversation.
Precisely. And that reminds me, the podcast doesn't just focus on what to say, but how to say it. Remember that ship versus sheep example? That was all about pronunciation, those subtle sounds.
Yeah, those tiny details can make a huge difference in whether people understand you or not. Makes me wonder, as a language expert, what are some other sounds that English learners tend to struggle with?
Oh, that's a good one. English has a lot of vowel sounds, which can be tricky for people whose native language doesn't have as many. Like, the difference between cat and cut or bed and bad can be hard to hear and say correctly.
Yeah, it's like learning to hear and make sounds you never even knew existed.
Exactly. And then there are those consonant clusters, like the straw in street or splin in split. Those can be real tongue twisters.
Oh, tell me about it.
Yeah.
I remember wrestling with those when I was learning, your native language. It's funny how your mouth has to learn these whole new ways to move.
It is. It really shows that learning a language is physical as much as it is mental. You're training your mouth to do new stuff.
So for our listener who's just starting out, any advice on how to deal with those pronunciation challenges?
Well, first off, don't be scared to try things out and make mistakes. The more you practice, the better you'll get at hearing and making the sounds. And there's tons of help out there, like online dictionaries with audio, pronunciation apps, even YouTube videos that break down specific sounds.
That's great advice. And it kind of goes back to what we talked about with immersion. Watching movies, listening to music, that kind of stuff can help you get a feel for how sounds work in real speech.
Absolutely. The more you hear the language, the more your ear gets tuned in. to those little differences.
Like you're training your ear to be a pronunciation detective.
I like that. It's all about paying attention to those details, noticing the little changes in sound that you might not have picked up on before.
Oh, and speaking of details, I got to mention something else from the podcast transcript. I loved how they snuck some humor in there. Remember the sound effects for ship and sheep? It's a small thing, but it makes it more memorable.
It did. And it reminds us that learning doesn't have to be a chore, you know? It can be fun. In fact, the more fun you have, the more likely you are to stick with it.
So true. I'm all about finding ways to make learning enjoyable. It's got to be something that sparks your interest, that keeps you coming back for more.
And those resources can be anything, you know? Apps, podcasts, movies, TV, music, even books. It's all about finding what works for you and how you like to learn.
Exactly. And it's about embracing the whole journey. Learning a language takes time. It's not about rushing to the finish line.
Well said. It's about enjoying the ride, celebrating those little wins along the way, and never losing sight of why you started in the first place.
All right, before we get too philosophical here, let's bring it back to our listener and their goal of getting comfortable with basic English conversation. We've talked about a lot, but is there anything else you'd recommend they really focus on?
That's a good question. I think building on what we've already said, it's important to remember that fluency isn't just about knowing the right words or grammar rules. It's about being able to use the language, out in the real world.
So it's not just what you know, but how you use it.
Exactly. And that's where practice comes in. The more you actually speak English with other people, the more comfortable and confident you'll become.
So basically, our listeners shouldn't be shy about using their English, even if they don't feel totally confident yet.
No way. You're going to make mistakes. It's bound to happen. And that's actually a good thing. It's how you learn. What matters is that you see those mistakes as opportunities to get better.
I like that mindset. Don't be afraid of the bumps in the road. They're part of the journey.
Exactly. They're like stepping stones to becoming fluent.
And remember, you don't have to do it alone. There are tons of people and resources out there to help you along the way. Online communities, language exchange partners, even classes or tutors if you prefer that. So if our listener is feeling a bit overwhelmed, they should remember that there's a whole cheering section out there rooting for them.
Exactly. And we're part of that cheering section too. We're here to guide you, encourage you, and celebrate all those little wins along the way.
It's good to be reminded of that sometimes. We're all in this together. Speaking of togetherness, I'm curious, what do you think about the role of culture in language learning? Like, do you think it's important to learn about the culture of the language you're studying?
Oh, that's an interesting question. And I'd say the answer is a definite yes. You can't really separate language from culture. They're woven together.
So understanding the culture can actually make you better at understanding the language.
Absolutely. When you learn about people's customs, their values, their beliefs, it helps you understand why they use certain expressions, why they structure sentences in certain ways, even why they use certain body language.
It's like you're getting a peek into the heart of the language.
I love that. It's about understanding the soul of the language, not just the rules.
And that makes the whole learning process more meaningful, more enjoyable.
Definitely. It adds a whole other dimension to it.
So, for our listener who's just getting started with English, any tips on how to explore the culture along with the language?
Oh, tons of ways. Watch English movies and TV shows, listen to English music, read English books and articles, even connect with English speakers online or in person.
Those are great ideas, and it doesn't have to be formal studying, right? It can be just enjoying a movie with subtitles, listening to a song you like, chatting with someone online.
Exactly. Make it fun and find ways to fit it into your everyday life.
And speaking of everyday life, what about technology? There are so many apps and websites for learning languages now. It's kind of mind-blowing.
It really is. Technology has totally changed how we learn languages. There are some amazing tools out there now that can help you with all sorts of things, from vocabulary and grammar to pronunciation and conversation practice.
It's incredible. But it's also kind of overwhelming. Where do you even begin with all those choices? What advice would you give our listener for navigating this whole world of digital language learning?
Good question. I think the most important thing is to figure out what you want to achieve and how you like to learn. What are your goals? What parts of the language do you want to focus on? What kind of learning style works best for you? Once you know that, you can start checking out different apps and websites and see which ones fit you best.
So do your research and be deliberate about it.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to try different things. Play around with a few apps or websites and see what clicks.
And there's no rule that says you can only use one thing, right? You can mix and match different resources to create your own personalized learning experience.
Totally. It's all about finding what works for you and makes learning enjoyable and effective.
Well said.
Yeah.
All right, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to go back to something we touched on earlier, the power of immersion. We've talked about movies, music, books, but what about actually going to an English-speaking country?
That's the ultimate immersion experience. There's nothing quite like being surrounded by the language all the time. It can really speed up your learning and give you a deeper understanding of the culture.
I bet. It's like taking everything you learned in the classroom and putting it to the test in the real world.
Exactly. And it's not just about practicing your speaking, it's about experiencing the language in all its forms, from how people greet each other to how they express their feelings.
You're soaking it all in through all your senses.
Exactly. It's a total immersion experience.
So for our listener who's maybe dreaming of visiting an English-speaking country someday, any advice on how to prepare for that?
Well, first of all, don't feel like you have to jump into the deep end right away. You don't need to book a flight to London or New York just yet. There are ways to experience English-speaking cultures closer to home. You could join a local conversation group, volunteer with an organization that works with English speakers, even just chat with a tourist in your city.
Those are great ideas. It's all about finding those opportunities to practice and immerse yourself no matter where you are.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of just listening and watching. Pay attention to how people speak, what expressions they use, how they interact with each other.
Like you're a language detective, gathering clues and figuring out how it all works in the real world.
I love that. It's about being curious, paying attention, and being open to new experiences.
Well said. Okay, as much as I'm loving this chat, I realize we're running a bit short on time. But before we move on to our final thoughts, I want to give our listener one last chance to think about what we've covered today. What are your key takeaways from this deep dive?
That's a good one. I think for me, the biggest takeaway is to approach language learning with a sense of curiosity, Be playful, be persistent. It's a journey with its ups and downs, but it's ultimately a really rewarding experience that can open up a whole new world for you.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that's a perfect way to transition into our final thoughts, ready to wrap things up.
I am. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say as we close out this deep dive adventure.
It's really kind of wild how much we got out of just one little podcast episode. I mean, who would have thought a simple transcript could lead to such a deep conversation,
It really shows you that you can learn from anything if you approach it the right way. And yeah, that podcast was definitely for beginners, but even WE got some good reminders about how we learn languages and about the importance of culture and all that.
Exactly. And that brings us back to why you, our listener. Remember, the whole point of this deep dive was to help you feel more confident about having basic conversations in English. And just by listening along with us, you've already gotten a taste of those essential greetings, how to introduce yourself, some important vocabulary, even a little bit of pronunciation practice. That's a lot to pack into one deep dive.
Yeah, it is. But it's really just the tip of the iceberg, What we looked at was just the first episode of this podcast, and they hinted at all sorts of stuff they'll cover later on, like how to order food, ask for directions, talk about what you did that day. It's all part of that journey towards being able to speak fluently.
So if you're feeling inspired, listener, keep going. There are tons of resources out there, podcasts, apps, websites. There are even in-person classes, if that's more your style. Just explore and see what you enjoy.
And don't forget about real-life practice. Find ways to actually use your English, even if it feels a bit awkward at first. Ordering coffee, chatting with other people who are learning English. Every time you do it, you're reinforcing what you've learned.
It's like taking it from the page to the street. That's where the real learning happens.
Totally. And it goes back to that idea of being patient. You're going to mess up sometimes. It's inevitable. But don't let that get you down.
You know what? I'd even say embrace those mistakes. Every time you mess up, it's a chance to learn something and improve your skills.
I like that. Think of them as stepping stones leading you towards fluency.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a thought that goes beyond just English. Learning a new language is like a gift you give to yourself. It's a journey where you discover new things about yourself. It connects you with different people and cultures, and it opens up all kinds of amazing possibilities.
Yeah, embrace the challenge, enjoy the process, and never stop exploring. That's the cool thing about language learning. It's a journey that never really ends. There's always something new to discover.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So until our next deep dive adventure, happy learning, everyone.